Good morning, everybody. My name is Alex, and Stephen, I hope you forgive me for the title of this video. I simply couldn't help myself. Today, I want to respond to Stephen's Rationality Rules. His recent video called My Views on Morality is an interesting and unique take, but I think it fails for a fairly specific reason. Stephen and I have privately discussed morality at length and have some long-standing disagreements, and I thought it would be fruitful to make some of these discrepancies public. Now, Stephen advocates for the idea that morality is objective, that there are facts that can be known about ethics, and that ethical statements are propositions that contain truth value. He thinks that there are moral facts. I've always maintained a non-cognitivist approach, believing that morality is entirely subjective and has no basis in analytical or empirical facts. Stephen's video attempts to show how moral facts can be derived, and because I only want to address specific points and there is a considerable level of agreement between us, I won't be responding to the entire video, but I disagree with his ultimate conclusion, and of course the link to Stephen's full video is in the description, and I'd recommend watching it fully to understand mine. So to outline his moral ideas, Stephen begins by identifying the classic problem with trying to prove moral truths. That's the is-ought distinction attributed to David Hume. Essentially, this is an observation that statements about how things are can never inform statements about how things should be. Hume defines two types of statements. First, statements like X is the case, and second, statements like X ought to be the case. Hume writes that you can say X is the case, Y is the case, Z is the case, and you can keep going, but you'll never arrive at an ought. You can't say this is the case, and therefore you ought to do this, because you're making a leap from description to prescription. I'll let Stephen explain.
For example, consider this seemingly sound argument. Premise 1, humans typically die if they're hanged. Premise 2, Ken is a human. Therefore, we ought not to hang Ken. This looks like a valid deductive argument, but it's not. It's a non sequitur. Even with both premises being true, the conclusion doesn't logically follow. It attempts to get a prescriptive statement from descriptive facts, but it fails. Sure, humans tend to die if hanged, and Ken is indeed a human, but how exactly do these statements of fact tell us that we ought not to hang Ken? Exactly, they don't.
They don't, because whilst it is the case that Ken will die if we hang him, we can't prove that this is a bad thing to do, that we ought not do it. That's an extra assumption that requires its own justification, and there's no amount of descriptive facts that could provide this justification. They're all is statements and have nothing to do with how we ought to behave. So far, this all sounds perfectly agreeable to me, but Stephen, and this is where the divergence occurs, Stephen says that you can get to an ought in the conclusion of an argument. He just says that you have to do it differently. So let's see what he means. But first, a definition. A deductive argument is one where if the premises are true, then it logically follows that the conclusion must also be true. For example, premise 1, all cats are black. Premise 2, Tom is a cat. Conclusion, Tom is black. Obviously, this argument is wrong because the first premise is wrong, but it's still deductive because if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. There's no way that it could be false. Stephen thinks that it's possible to produce a sound deductive argument with true premises that has an ought in the conclusion, but doesn't try to get an ought from an is. Now, let me be clear. If Stephen can produce a sound deductive argument with an ought in the conclusion that doesn't derive from an is, I will change my mind and believe morality to be objective immediately. He wins the argument, because the conclusion would have to be true. So let's see the rather fascinating way Stephen tries to do this.
So how then can we derive a valid ought? Well, it's actually very easy. It's by having a valid deductive argument that includes at least one ought. Or in other words, it's by getting an ought from an ought. For example, premise 1, we ought to live consistently with our evolution. This is an ought. Premise 2, humans evolved to eat meat. This is an is. Therefore, we ought to eat meat.
So, Stephen wants to get an ought from an ought. In other words, the is-ought problem is avoided by including an ought in the premises, rather than having the premises consisting of only is statements. We've seen that you can't get an ought from an is, sure, but you can definitely get an is from an is, and you can also get an ought from an ought. Okay, interesting. But your first question should be this. How can you know that a premise involving an ought is true? Sure, an ought premise could inform an ought conclusion, but you'd need to prove that the ought statement in the premise is correct. The example Stephen just gave is a clever one because it has an ought premise that most people would consider to be untrue, and this identifies the problem. You can't just stick an ought in the premises, you have to make sure that the ought premise that you're proposing is actually correct. In order to produce a good deductive argument, the ought premise must be justified so that we can use it to inform our ought conclusion. So how does Stephen say that we can do this? How can we produce an ought premise that we know is true? Well, he makes a distinction of his own. Stephen says that there are in fact two types of oughts. He calls them axiomatic oughts.
Axiomatic oughts are feelings of obligation that exist self-evidently, and they do so without proof or argument. They just are. They're facts of nature.
And contingent oughts.
And contingent oughts are feelings of obligation that are predicated on axiomatic oughts and one or more statements of fact. And because they're predicated on statements of fact that may or may not be correct, they too may or may not be correct.
In other words, there are some oughts that are a product of other information. You ought to do this because of this. But there's also a classification of oughts that are just true in their own right. You ought to do this, full stop. This second type is what he calls an axiomatic ought. This axiomatic contingent ought distinction is similar but not the same as Kant's hypothetical and categorical imperatives. The idea is this: you can't have a contingent ought in your premises because they're not self-evidently true, and so you can't know for sure if the premise is correct. However, you can have an axiomatic ought in your premises because these require no justification or proof. They're simply true. And if these ought statements are self-evidently true and we can know them to be true, then we can use them in our premises in order to get an ought in our conclusion. We can derive moral facts. Now, Stephen is absolutely right in that if there really are such things as axiomatic oughts, oughts that are true as a fact of nature, then we can construct a deductive moral argument and show that there are such things as objective moral facts. So I want to demonstrate why I think that the argument that Stephen presents for the existence of axiomatic oughts is flawed, and why I think that what he's calling axiomatic oughts are actually not what he makes them out to be. Of course, these ideas are unique to Stephen, and I may have misunderstood them or missed something important, but hopefully if that is the case, then this video can help prevent others from making the same mistakes. Otherwise, the key point is this: I agree with Stephen that you can't get an ought from an is. I agree that you need an ought in the premises to get an ought in the conclusion. I just don't think that you can do it. I agree that if axiomatic oughts do exist, then you can use them in your premises and morality can be objective. I just don't think that they do exist. If I'm wrong about this one single thing, the existence of axiomatic oughts, my entire criticism crumbles. So let's jump into why I'm not convinced by Stephen's description of them, using his examples as much as possible. And if I seem to be repeating myself or overdoing a point, it's because this is quite a confusing topic and I want to ensure that we're all on the same page.
Axiomatic oughts are feelings of obligation that exist self-evidently, and they do so without proof or argument. They just are. They're facts of nature. An example is my current conviction that I ought to survive. I didn't reason myself into this ought, I just have it. It's an axiomatic fact of nature, not an assumption.
So here's where I see the confusion. Stephen is saying that it's an axiomatic ought that he ought to survive because he simply has that ought innately within him. But here's the thing, you don't have the ought to survive. You have a conviction that you ought to survive. When Stephen talks about axiomatic oughts, I think he's really talking about what could be called axiomatic desires. It's not that we innately ought to survive, it's that we innately feel as though we ought to survive. Now, he's right to say that you, quote, just have it. I think he's right that none of us reason our way into wanting to survive. We just do. This is a fact of nature. It's true that we want to survive. You could call this an axiomatic desire or an axiomatic predisposition. You just can't call it an axiomatic ought. Axiomatic means self-evident and unquestionable, and so to call the ought to survive an axiomatic ought means that it's self-evident and undeniable, an undeniable fact that we ought to survive. But I think Stephen is confusing the ought to survive with the belief that we ought to survive. Let me explain further. There is an axiomatic quality in the idea of survival. Remember, axiomatic means undeniably or self-evidently true. Our evolutionary history has tuned us into creatures that have a desire to survive. This is the axiomatic part that I think Stephen might be skirting around and confusing for something else. It's undeniably true that human beings have an innate desire to survive, since if our species had no desire to survive, it simply wouldn't have, and natural selection would have made us extinct hundreds of thousands of years ago. As Stephen alludes to, we didn't reason ourselves into this. It's genetic, it's evolutionary, printed into the fibre of our DNA, the conviction that survival is preferable. But here's the thing. Whilst it may be axiomatically true that human beings feel as though they ought to survive, that doesn't make it axiomatically true that they ought to survive. As I've just explained, it's undeniable that human beings are born with a desire to survive, but just because we innately desire survival, it doesn't follow that it's innately true that survival is good or that we ought to survive. That's a separate claim. And this is the heart of my problem with the idea of axiomatic oughts as Stephen, if I correctly understand him, is presenting. We have to be careful not to confuse facts about holding a belief and facts about the belief itself. For instance, it's a fact that John believes Oxford University to be superior to Cambridge University. Is Oxford actually better than Cambridge? It doesn't matter. Even if John's wrong and Oxford isn't better than Cambridge, it's still a fact that he believes that Oxford is better than Cambridge. That's a fact about John holding the belief, not a fact about John's belief itself. So let's take a less subjective example. Let's say that John also believes the Earth is flat. It's true that John believes the Earth is flat. Obviously, this can be true at the same time as the Earth not actually being flat in reality, and that's because whilst his belief itself is false, the fact that he believes it is true. It's true that he holds the belief even if the belief itself is false. This is the key point, and that's why I'm pressing it. So now let's take Stephen's example. The belief is this: I ought to survive. I'll play something again for you. Stephen says this.
An example is my current conviction that I ought to survive. I didn't reason myself into this ought, I just have it. It's an axiomatic fact of nature, not an assumption.
And he's right. It is a fact of nature that he has the compulsion to survive. It is an axiomatic fact that he believes that he should survive. But pay attention, this is a fact about holding the belief, not the belief itself. It may be a fact of nature that Stephen believes he ought to survive, but it's not a fact of nature that he ought to survive. The only thing that can be axiomatically true is that he holds the belief. This is a fact about his brain, his psychology, but it doesn't follow, however, that the belief itself is therefore axiomatically true.
Now that might seem dissatisfying, but so too, at least in my opinion, are all axiomatic facts. While it's not justified, it really is the case that I have this compulsion, this ought, this impulse, this urge to behave in a certain way, and this can be objectively verified through the scientific method, and so it's a scientific fact. And what's more, thanks to Darwin, we now know precisely why I have it in the first place.
This is all true, of course. It's true that you have this compulsion. It's true that we can explain why you have this compulsion. It's true that most people in the world share this compulsion. But none of this makes the compulsion itself true. It doesn't make it false, it just doesn't say anything about the truth content of the belief itself. It's true that you believe you ought to survive, but that's not the same as it being true that you ought to survive. So now, with that, I want to show why I think this specific confusion leads to the downfall of Stephen's ethical framework. Remember, ultimately, Stephen is trying to show that you can have a deductive moral argument where the conclusion includes an ought. Let's quickly refresh the problem with this. You can't get an ought from an is. The deductive argument can't only have is statements for premises if it wants to have an ought in the conclusion. As Stephen explained, this would be a non sequitur. In order to get an ought in the conclusion, there must be at least one ought in the premises, allowing you to get an ought from an ought. Stephen does this with the following example.
Premise 1, I ought to prevent my child from suffering. Premise 2, it is the case that vaccinating my child will reduce her chances of suffering. Therefore, I ought to vaccinate my child.
He later says that this argument is, quote, correct because its premises are correct. So this is crucial. This is a deductive argument, and so yes, if those premises are both correct, then the conclusion is true. We can have an ought in the conclusion because there's an ought in the first premise. But are the premises true? Well, premise 2 certainly is. It's a fact of science that vaccinations reduce the chances of suffering. But take a look at the first premise. This is an example of one of Stephen's axiomatic oughts, an ought that's self-evident and undeniable. But now let's apply my criticism that Stephen confuses facts about holding a belief and facts about the belief itself. It may be a fact, an axiomatic fact if you will, that a parent innately believes that they ought to prevent their child from suffering, but that doesn't make it a fact that they ought to do so. When Stephen says, quote, "nature has made it so that we're born with axiomatic oughts," it seems to me that what he really means is that nature has made it so that we're born with axiomatic beliefs, including beliefs about how we ought to behave. Parents do naturally believe that they ought to prevent their child from suffering, but that doesn't make it true that they ought to do so. So in light of this, we can adapt the first premise of Stephen's argument. Really, it should read, Premise 1, I hold the belief that I ought to prevent my child from suffering. This is the fact of nature. This is the axiomatic belief that's innate within us. Premise 2, vaccinating my child will reduce the chances of suffering. In conclusion, I ought to vaccinate my child. Do you see the problem here? Based on what Stephen has explained he means by axiomatic oughts, we've actually transformed the first premise from an ought statement into an is statement. The word ought is still in the premise, but don't let that confuse you. The fact isn't that I ought to prevent my child from suffering. The fact is that I believe this to be the case. It's like having a premise that says, John believes blue is the best colour. This may be true, but that doesn't make it true that blue is the best colour. It's true that parents believe that they ought to prevent their children from suffering, but that doesn't make it true that parents ought to prevent their children from suffering. The first premise is now just a plain old is statement. So remember, we said that in order to have an ought statement in the conclusion, you must have an ought statement in the premises. Now, Stephen has tried to do this by describing so-called axiomatic oughts that can be put in a premise without need for justification. But I hope that I've shown somewhat clearly enough why I think his axiomatic oughts are actually just facts about holding beliefs and ultimately are just is statements, meaning that they can't in fact inform a moral conclusion. It's worth noting, of course, that this doesn't mean that the premises I ought to survive or I ought to prevent my child from suffering are false. They may well be correct. But contrary to Stephen's claim, I just don't think that they're self-evidently correct, axiomatically correct. The only thing we do know to be true is the fact that people believe these things, not that the beliefs themselves are correct. If someone can find another way to show that these ought statements are correct, then we can use them in our premises. But claiming that they're just correct by nature and that we know this because we all feel deeply that this is the case, which is essentially what I think Stephen is trying to do, just doesn't cut it for me. Until you can justifiably show that these ought statements are correct in a way that doesn't ultimately derive from an is, and isn't simply the statement that they're just correct and that's that because we feel that way, we're stuck with the problem of never being able to derive moral facts and can't make any claim to their objectivity. Stephen's argument that you can get an ought from an ought is absolutely true, and if he can find a way to get an ought statement into his premises and justify that ought statement, then as far as I can see, his theory holds. But according to my understanding, Stephen hasn't proved that his ought statements are true. He's just appealed to nature, to the fact that people believe that these ought statements are true. His whole argument relies on the idea that there are such things as axiomatic oughts, and so if this turns out to be a confused or fallacious notion, the argument fails. So ultimately, the main point of this video, the takeaway, is this. Even if it's true that you believe that you ought to do X, that doesn't mean it's true that you ought to do X. You could be wrong. You can always be wrong. And in the spirit of fairness, so could I. I could be wrong about all of this, and if there's one person I think is capable of just devastating my ethical ideas, it's Stephen, so I'll be eagerly awaiting his reaction to what I've said, and if I am wrong, I can hopefully make a future video explaining what my mistakes were. I hope this response hasn't been too in-depth for your taste, but equally I realise that I've repeated the same point quite a lot in this video just to ensure that people really understand what I'm saying and to drive the point home, so I hope I didn't bore or patronise you either. If any of you want some clarification or want me to respond to a different facet of Stephen's philosophy, then you can of course let me know in the comments. Stephen, if you're watching, I'd love to hear your thoughts, and to everyone else, I've been Alex O'Connor, or Cosmic Skeptic. You can find me on social media here. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.